Welcome to another episode of the How to Fight with a Longsword series, or in other words, the Lichtenauer Tradition Longsword Fencing Basic course. In this last episode of the series, we'll be taking a look at the historical sources. If you are following this series as a basic course, this training session is reserved for sparring. Now, before we start with the actual subject of this episode, please do note that the incorrect examples are exaggerated on purpose so that the issues are easier to see. All of the techniques based on the historical sources are shown according to my current interpretations. As such, they are subject to change if I ever come up with or run into a better interpretation. Let's start with Lichtenauer. Lichtenauer is a webpage which has pretty much every imaginable historical source available for free. That is, both translated and transcripted. If you are at all interested in the historical sources, please go and take a look at the Lichtenauer. In addition to the historical sources, it has a huge amount of related articles. I have a bunch of Lichtenauer links in the description. I would like to add that I have no connection to Lichtenauer whatsoever. I just think that it is a great webpage and an invaluable tool for the HEMA community. If nothing else, go and read a bit of one of the three sources that were used as the base for this basic course. As I mentioned in the introductory episode, I used the glosses by Pseudo von Danzig, Sigmund ein Ringek and Pseudo Hans Döbringer as the base for this basic course. I have the links for all three of those in the description. These are a rather common trio of sources which are used as the base for teaching Lichtenauer style longsword fencing. It is also rather common to just use the Danzig manuscript, and less commonly just the Ringek one. There is a very good reason for this. Both Danzig and Ringek offer an extensive and complete gloss on the longsword portion of the Zettel. Danzig and Ringek are also very close to each other in content, but there are some differences. At least in my opinion, studying both gives a wider and more complete view on the system. Döbringer has rather clear differences to those two, and the gloss is rather limited in multiple places. The reason I like to use it as a supplemental source is that it has a rather extensive common advice section at the beginning of the gloss. That is something which is not found in the two other sources, and it talks about subjects such as how to hold a sword. If you wish to start studying the sources, I would recommend that you start with either Danzig or Ringek. In my opinion, Danzig is the slightly easier one to read, even though I personally prefer the Ringek manuscript. There is also quite a lot of other material outside these three sources which is related to the Lichtenauer tradition. The first thing is that the Zettel actually has three parts. The first part is the longsword, that is what we have been learning. In the context of the Zettel, the word longsword doesn't refer to the specific weapon we see as a longsword. In the context of referring to a specific style of a weapon, the term longsword is a more modern term. In the context of the Zettel, the term longsword means using the weapon in two hands and extended. In other words, long. The second part of the Zettel is the short sword. These days this is commonly called half-swording. Basically this means that we are still using the same weapon, what we would call a longsword, but now you are holding it so that one hand is at the hilt and the other hand is holding the sword at the middle of the blade. Thus you are holding the sword shortened or short. This is how this weapon is used in armor. The third part of the Zettel is about mounted fencing. That is simply fencing on horseback. Then there is what is called the Fellowship of Lichtenauer. The Fellowship is a list of 17 masters which can be found in three of Paulus Kall's manuscripts. What the Fellowship of Lichtenauer actually was is still unclear, but the teachings of these 17 masters are seen as part of the Lichtenauer tradition. For example, the wrestling of Odd Jude. In addition to that, there are multiple manuscripts and treatises which are more or less related to the Chettel of Johannes Lichtenauer. A good and well-known example is a later treatise by Joachim Meyer. For a more complete list on what is seen as part of the Lichtenauer tradition, please refer to Lichtenauer. For example, the Fellowship of Lichtenauer page has a great link list. The link to that page is in the description. When reading the sources, there are a few very important things to keep in mind. These things very much dictate how I interpret the sources. The first thing is that we must assume that the authors knew what they were talking about. Otherwise, there is no basis for humor. If we don't believe that the people who wrote the glosses actually wrote about working techniques, why should we bother training any of them? I also believe that at this point we already have enough practical experience to support this assumption. We also need to understand that the texts and those who wrote them are not infallible. The glosses themselves don't agree on everything, and I think that there are very likely mistakes in the texts. If you've ever tried to write down anything longer, it should be clear how easy it is to make mistakes. Based on these, we can assume that the technique should work, but there is a chance that there is a mistake in the text. As such, we should give our best efforts to make the techniques work as described in the texts, but we should not over-fixate on single words or wordings. This is especially true as most of us will be using a translation of the original text. Even if you are reading the original text, it was written hundreds of years ago. Misunderstanding things is very likely. Then we get to the images. I am very careful when trusting them. There are a bunch of clear issues with them. The first thing is that they are a product of their time. How much did the art style of the time affect the accurate portrayal of the situation? Was the art actually checked by the author or not? Are the illustrations later additions by someone else? Are the illustrations based on models or descriptions? If models were used, were they actually fencing in the correct way, or was it their personal style? The list just goes on. In addition to all of this, in multiple places the images clearly don't match the text. For example, the fluke is explained as: stand with your left foot before and hold your sword with crossed hands, with the pommel below you near your right side on your hip. However, in the illustration the pommel is pulled far back and it is nowhere near the hip. There are all kinds of issues with the images all over the manuscripts. However, my point is not that you should not absolutely trust the images. My point is that you should be very critical with them. They can be a great help when trying to interpret the sources, but I would not get stuck on trying to exactly match any of the illustrations. When interpreting the sources, I also consider how the technique would work with a sharp sword. If you only consider modern training tools, you will inevitably get a distorted view on swords. Firstly, swords are not lightsabers, and secondly, sharp swords will penetrate into your opponent's sword if you are doing things correctly. That means that you also need to get the sword out of your opponent's body to be able to continue using it. These are just two things which you easily forget when using blunt training tools. Finally, and most importantly, I always consider good body mechanics. If there is something which would get me hurt in the long run, I simply won't do it. I presume that those writing the glosses would have known better than to injure themselves or their students. I could keep talking about all of this for a very long time, but I don't think it would be very useful in this context. What I want you to take from this episode is to go and take a look at the historical sources. It is very easy to do. Another thing is that we are trying to interpret hundreds of years old texts. There is no way to be 100% correct, or at least there is no way to know that we are correct. If someone is claiming that their interpretation is the absolute truth, I would be very skeptical about them. And that also goes for my teachings. The best we can do is to make an educated guess.